If you look beyond the decoration on this painting, what you see underneath is just flowy, flowy watercolor. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and rules to help you achieve that process. If you think about the concept of greater water always flowing into lesser water, it will help you when you're trying to achieve flow. Throughout this class, we'll be working wet into wet, which means we'll have wet paper and wet paint. Getting your paper to that perfect wet consistency when you first start out can be a little tricky, so I'm going to show you how I do it. It's a neat little trick. To wet this circle, I'll start out by using a fully loaded brush, so I've got it completely full of water. Then I'll just start to fill in the circle. You can see how many times I put my brush back into the water. When my brush starts to drag on the tooth of the paper, I will dip it back into the water and add more. I continue through this process until the space is completely filled with water. In essence, I'm using a little too much water. When you get finished filling the circle, you'll notice that there are puddles, and if you were to pick it up and slant the paper, the water would probably run outside of the circle. This is when I use the concept of greater flowing into lesser. If you had a wet floor, you would use a dry mop to pick up the water, right? You're going to do the same thing here. I tap my brush onto my paper towel, releasing water from the brush. I then swipe through my circle, pick up water, and drop it back off on my paper towel. Using this process ensures that I have even coverage throughout the area. It also gives the water time to sink into the tooth of the paper so that when you introduce paint, it's going to flow. This may seem like a really simple concept, but do think about it when you're painting. Learning how to control watercolor is really all about learning how to control your water content. It doesn't matter if you're just using plain, clean water or if the water is mixed with color. The rule still applies. Greater water will always flow into lesser water. You can see that concept here where I don't have quite enough water and color on my brush to get the flow that I want. If I increase the water and color on my brush and fully load my brush, when I tap it to the paper, it will create a beautiful flow. You can use the mop technique throughout the process of painting. If you start to see areas in your painting where pooling and puddling are happening and you don't want them to, you can simply mop the water out. While your paper is still wet, you can continue to work. You can add more intense color or mop areas out. Using this method will also give you pretty consistent results as your watercolor starts to dry because you don't have pools and puddles of water. In this circle, instead of mopping the water out, I've left it over full. You can see that when I apply my paint, it definitely flows. It goes all over the place. I have very little control of what's happening. Just keep in mind that none of these techniques are wrong. They're just different processes that will produce different results. So using a lot of water will create some really dynamic effects, but it's also very hard to control, and it has a mind of its own when it dries. In this circle, I've barely filled it with water, so I used about one brush load for the entire circle. When I apply my paint, you can see that it does flow in some areas, but the results are inconsistent. Remember, not a wrong technique, just a different one that will produce different results. This actually works really well when you're working in a small, tiny space and you want to have really intense color. You have a pretty high level of control of where your paint is going to go and how it's going to dry. I hope you found these techniques helpful, and now let's get started painting feathers.